Is the universe or Earth finely tuned for us, or is it that we thrive because these are the optimal conditions for our kind of life? In other words, couldn't it be the case that evolution has finely tuned us for the universe?
No. Let me expound upon that a little bit. Again,
Please do.
The issue is, in order to have anything interesting, you've got to have these fine-tuned conditions. Because if, let's say, gravity were too strong or too weak, you wouldn't have planets or stars. You just have a bunch of black holes or a thin soup of hydrogen atoms. So to get anything like life, you've got to have chemistry. To have chemistry, you've got to have the right balance of forces, you've got to have the right masses and charges and so forth. To get the atoms of the periodic table is what requires such enormous fine-tuning. So if the universe were only, let's say, hydrogen or just heavy metals, you wouldn't have life. You must have carbon. People think, what if you could have like silicon-based life, like in aliens? Well, the problem is silicon has much weaker chemical bonds than carbon, so you wouldn't be able to create the stable structures for organic life. Plus, if you combine silicon with oxygen, and oxygen is necessary as an energy source, you don't get carbon dioxide, which is a gas, you get sand. That's not going to work so well for a cell. To have life, you've got to have liquid water, and you have to have all these amazing properties to stabilize the temperature, to have an atmosphere with enough oxygen that doesn't burn up your forests. So any type of life which is at all plausible requires enormous amounts of fine-tuning. In fact, I mentioned Michael Denton. He has a great book called Nature's Destiny. And if you look at the way DNA works, you look at proteins, it's not clear there's a whole lot of ways to do this. So maybe there may be a few other possibilities, but they also would require enormous amounts of fine-tuning. So it's not just that we have fine-tuning for our life, that we just happen to evolve to match the conditions. It has to be there for any life. That's key.
Would you like to say something?
There's something known in philosophy discussions as the anthropic principle. And some people will say, well, we shouldn't be surprised because if things weren't the way they are, we wouldn't be around to wonder about them. Here's a counterexample. Suppose you stand in front of a firing squad. They're all expert marksmen. And the guns all go off, and you're still alive. In fact, you haven't been hit at all. And somebody says to you, well, you shouldn't wonder about that because otherwise you wouldn't be around to wonder about it. Yeah, you should still wonder about it.
I think in follow-up to that, there's the implication that these are certain conditions that are necessary for life, and so we have to be adapted to said conditions or else we cannot live. But some people are asking something else. They're saying, what would be necessary to support the belief in the possibility of the existence of life beyond what we can experience? If the entire universe is so finely and specifically tuned to produce conditions that support our version of life, could they also support life, or could have supported life in vastly different circumstances and forms?
That's a great question, and we know the answer is yes, because at least within the Christian narrative, you believe in angels and demons, and obviously they don't have the same biochemistry as us. So there is an existence of other type of intelligent agents. But the issue is, if you look at your search according to life, which is at least within the realm of imagination, then what you find is you have a certain target you're looking at. And what happens is, within that target, there are so few ways to get life to exist. You can do what's called a conditional probability. What's the probability of life existing given that you're going to look at things that are at least remotely similar to what we're imagining? Not angels, but materialistic beings. Then you can say we definitely are seeing still evidence of fine-tuning. Here's another example. Imagine that you are shooting at targets, and there's targets that are all along some massive wall. Well, what happens is, if you hit a bullseye of a target, and that's the only target within like 1 million miles of that target, you can be pretty sure that that was a deliberate shot, even if there might be other targets someplace else.
In response, Dr. Larmer, you gave the example of the firing squad, and some people are asking a question that might question that analogy. They're asking, in the argument for the fine-tuning of the universe, time is an infinite measurable. In such a situation, even though 1 to the power of 10 to the power of 123 is indeed a large number, it is still a fraction in infinity, and hence it is a possibility. In simple terms, if atoms have nothing to do in infinity years but to crash against each other, isn't the given number fairly small compared to infinity, and hence making it a distinct possibility for fine-tuning by chance?
Actually, I think my compatriot here is probably better able to answer that, but I guess what I would say is we don't have infinite time. We know that the universe has a beginning, so the probability estimates that are given on the basis of our knowledge of a finite universe and how long a time we have to operate. Here might be another analogy. Suppose you're playing bridge and you go away to the washroom and you come back and you've got the perfect bridge hand. Well, you've got two hypotheses. One, that could be an accident. Two, it could be that somebody set it up. And if you keep getting perfect bridge hands, and getting perfect bridge hands is a whole lot easier than the numbers we were talking about earlier, at some point, given the two hypotheses, you're going to take the hypothesis of intelligent agency.
Yeah, and again, it is, as was spoken, our universe began. Time, space, matter, and energy began. And when it began, all of that fine-tuning had to be there right from the beginning. That's key. So time is not an issue. It doesn't matter how old the universe is. It will when I talk about origin of life, but at least in terms of the fine-tuning, that had to be at the very beginning. The only way people get around this problem is they posit that there is a virtually infinite number of other universes, all of which have slightly different conditions, again, like a Rick and Morty episode. And what happens is all of the justifications for that have to presuppose some universe-generating mechanism, which also has to be fine-tuned. The only way around this problem is just to postulate that there's an infinite number of universes with infinite possibilities for no reason whatsoever. It's just by fiat. So again, you're dealing with blind faith. So both the Christian and the atheist are positing an infinite entity of infinite potential. Either it's a creator that's intelligent, or it's an infinite number of universes with all possibilities. So in some sense, that's a draw. But I'll argue when you look at the origin of life, you're seeing not just that there's evidence of fine-tuning, but that there's an intelligent agent that acts within nature for a purpose.
Also, when you're making an argument, you should not start with the conclusion and then adjust your premises to get the conclusion. Rather, you should start with your premises and see what conclusion goes. So if your conclusion is, I don't want to believe in theism, therefore there must be an infinite number of universes, well, you haven't really given an argument.
This next question is directed to Dr. Larmer, but again, feel free to comment on it. Dr. Larmer, how can we not know that science will not eventually come up with an explanation for the origin of life?
Yeah, we're going to have a very good talk on it. What I would say, our first speaker today talked of certainty and probability. Probability can get to the point where we have virtual certainty, but still in logic, we could be mistaken. None of us really believes that in real life. So it would be an inductive argument. If somebody says, well, it's probable that science will give an explanation, the justification will be on the basis of how successful we've been in the past. Now, in the past, we've been very successful in describing and explaining what we could call nomenological science, things that are law-based, okay? But in terms of historical science, no. And really what's happening, let me give an analogy. Let's suppose you're a really good pigeon catcher, okay? And you are excellent at catching pigeons. Well, then you conclude that because you're excellent at catching pigeons, you're going to be good at catching foxes. It doesn't follow. The evidence you have that justifies you thinking you'll have success in catching pigeons does not justify you in thinking you'll have success in catching foxes. So our increasing knowledge of things like the cell, body structures, they don't make it easier. The inductive argument actually goes the other way. It makes it less probable that we'll have a natural explanation.
And the other thing that people have to realize is it's not just that there isn't natural processes that could create life, which I'll get into, or that there's enormous technical challenges to Darwinian evolution, or neo-Darwinism, or the modern synthesis, or whatever you want to call it. The additional thing is we see positive evidence for design. It's like when you look at the faces of presidents on Mount Rushmore, and you see, I really think I see evidence of an artist. You can't say that's the artist of the gaps fallacy, because there's positive evidence of an artist when you see the faces of presidents. And someone could say, who's a skeptic, could say, well, we just don't know. One day we can learn how erosion and wind and rain could produce the faces of presidents. You can't prove that we can't, and that's true. But we do see positive evidence of specified complexity, of information, of intentionality. In the same way, not only do we have enormous evidence that natural processes cannot create life or dramatically change it, we see positive evidence of design through the information, through the similarities to human engineering, and to the evidence of purpose and foresight.
This might be my philosophical quick dismissal of evolution, but it has struck me that in our experience, we're all fighting a losing battle with entropy. Some of us are closer than others. But the structures of life routinely break down. We're familiar with that. It's inevitable for us. The structures of life break down. Given that, then the question of how those structures actually came to exist in the first place is a really difficult question to answer without appealing to some kind of external intelligent agent.
In follow-up to this type of question came up a lot. What if the absence of evidence for evolution is on account of our inability to accurately observe a phenomenon? So to use your analogy, you talked about our ability to capture pigeons does not mean that we will also have an ability to capture foxes. Well, perhaps it's because we don't have the right tools. And the questioner gives some examples, like how there are revolutionary understandings in germ disease transmission prior to the microscopes, or Louis Pasteur's experiment showing particles in the air cause disease rather than air itself. Do limitations in our ability to observe the world falsely lead us to conclude that there is evidence of absence?
What happens is people are looking at this entirely backwards. Because when you talk about what can natural processes explain, you can talk about the Earth going around the sun, you can talk about crystal formation. Life is not like a crystal. Life is nanotechnology. When you look at a cell, it's like a spaceship. You've got machinery, you've got information processing, energy production. So what you always end up with is the materialism of the gaps fallacy. So what you find is every attempt to rationalize away the evidence for design, whether it be in the fine-tuning of the laws of physics, whether it be in the information in the cell, whether it be in the human eye, every explanation collapses when the science is better understood. Let me give you an example. If you look at one of the success stories of evolution, supposedly, is the evolution of the eye. The idea is that you've got a photoreceptor, a pinhole, you've got then a lens and a fully functional eye. That's a great story as long as you ignore the underlying biology. What's happened is as our understanding of biology is advanced, we now know that won't work. Because if you've got a photoreceptor, how do you evolve a lens? What do the first mutations do? They produce tissue in front of your photoreceptor. What is that called? That's called a cataract. That's called a tumor. Undifferentiated tissue is going to block your vision. Now, we also know because of genetics and because of embryology that to get a lens, you have to have an incredibly sophisticated developmental genetic regulatory network. That requires thousands and thousands and thousands of mutations to get that lens to form. And when you study the genetics, if one connection in that network collapses, your lens isn't going to work. So what you end up with is going from a photoreceptor to a lens, is going to be a selective disadvantage until thousands and thousands of mutations occur until you get a functional lens. So every single evolutionary explanation for anything complex becomes increasingly implausible as science advances. It's even worse with the origin of life. If you think of the origin of life as 1,000 steps, what happens is the more science advances, the more steps appear completely implausible, and the more implausible every step appears. So you're not dealing with a God of the gaps, it's a materialism of the gaps. Because life is technology, it's engineering, it's not like a crystal.
On a much less complicated note, people say philosophy is hard, but it seems to me philosophy is incredibly easy compared to what people like Michael Behe and my compatriot here are doing. I find it helpful to distinguish between two different kinds of order. There's order that's implicit in the natural things. So it's implicit in the nature of bodies with mass to attract one another. That will nicely explain the tides. But there's a different type of order, and that's imposed order. Order that's not inherent in the materials themselves. And what we're seeing in life is order that is very clearly imposed order. It's not implicit in the building blocks of life.
This question's open to both of you. How can you be sure of the thousands of deities worshipped by human beings since the beginning of time? Which god or gods so intelligently designed life?
Great question. And this would be nice at the end of the seminar, but what I'll talk about is the origin of life. So what you have is evidence of a deity, a creator outside of time and space, who created everything, the material world, through an act of that, it's the creator's will. With the origin of life, what you're seeing is that is not a deistic God. It's not a God who's outside watching from a distance, like the Beth Midler song. But it's a God who is involved in the world, shaping and creating life. Now that gets you pretty close. It doesn't get you all the way to Christianity, but it gets you to Islam, Christianity, Judaism, because the other visions of deities like pantheism aren't consistent with that picture. Like in pantheism, if you have a lot of different deities, then you'd expect many different types of life, right? We don't see that. We see one unifying pattern for all of life. It's a single creator. Now, to get to Christianity, you have to get beyond science into philosophy, into history, into different things like that, experience. So I would argue that if you look at the world, we see incredible design, but you also see a lot of suffering, a lot of evil, right? So if there's such a good and all-powerful God, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? That really only makes sense fully in the Christian narrative, because we believe in a God that created the world as good, but people had a choice to either serve that God or rebel from that God, and people chose to rebel. That created what we refer to as the fall, the pain, the problems in the world. And then within the Christian framework is unique in that our faith is based on historical reality. Jesus Christ came into the world as God in human form. He performed miracles, he cast out demons, he died, and he rose from the dead. And the resurrection is one of the best well-attested events of that time period in history. If you apply all the rational, logical methods of determining what in history is true, it points to the fact that the resurrection really happened. And plus, beyond that, it's not just the evidence, it's our personal experience. So for me, I was convinced Christianity was a psychological crutch. I said, God, if you're real, you have to show me what's true, because I'm a scientist, I just can't do this blindly. And then providentially, God put me in contact with the right people, and I've seen people healed of sickness in Jesus' name. I've seen supernatural encounters. I've experienced the love and power of God myself. So my faith is based both on the truth of science, on the history of the resurrection, and personally encountering God. But here's the key issue you have to realize. God's not lost, we are. The challenge of finding God isn't just an intellectual journey, it's the challenge of our pride. Are we willing to say, God, if you're real, help me to know the truth and I'll serve you, or do we want to be our own gods and do what we want to do? That's the challenge.
Traditionally, theologians have distinguished between what's called natural theology and revelation. The various arguments from natural theology, well, the cosmological argument will get us a universe. The teleological argument, which I take to be closely related to intelligent design, it'll tell us that that cause of the universe is intelligent. The moral argument will tell us that the cause of our morality has to be itself moral. But reason only takes us so far. Like, I can look down at Michael Behe and I can make some inferences. Okay? But if I... well, age, nice dresser. He said he would dress down today to fit in with the rest of us. I can make some inferences and know something about him. But if I'm really going to know about him, he has to reveal himself to me. And if you want to know the other, you can know something about the other just by observing the other. But if the other is a person, you have to have that person speak to you. The other knows you back. So natural theology takes us so far. Revelation is the story of us not using our best thoughts to find out what we can know about God, but God actually talking back to us and saying, here's what I'm like. So if I want to know what Michael's like, I've got to engage him in conversation.
I thought I heard you say, if I look down at Miller, but given your height, that might be difficult.
That I look down at Michael. Actually, I look up to him. My books don't get read as much as his do.
I think this is a good follow-up question. So if the universe is finally tuned by the God as we understand him in Christianity, a God who is loving, a God who is good, a God who wants to know us, why are there so many unlivable conditions on Earth where life cannot exist or survive? For example, the tundra, the desert, where there's less land and less water, more salt water than fresh water, and you can even include natural disasters in this. Or more broadly, if the universe is so designed, what about the flaws in its design that we see?
Well, what's really interesting is we do see life in the tundra. We do see life in the most extreme conditions in the desert. So the fact there's a diversity of conditions creates different palettes which the artist can create on. So what you see is the most amazing diversity of life, even like deep in the bottom of the ocean under the rocks, even in caves with hydrogen sulfide and things like that. So again, you do see life everywhere, and it just gives more opportunity for the creator to create incredible beauty. You could ask, well, why can't we live between stars? Why can't we live in different parts of our universe? Why just Earth? Well, I don't know, if you ever talk to a billionaire that creates a house on an enormous ranch, that billionaire may only be able to live in the house, but the rest of that ranch is there to appreciate the beauty. So we look at our universe, and the fact that our universe is studyable, we can look at the distant stars, which is essentially like looking in a time machine in the past. So we can actually see how the Creator brought about so much of creation. We can see His majesty. We can see the incredible nature of science. So it's not surprising that we can only live on Earth and different organisms can only live in certain conditions. In fact, part of the role of the Creator is to create community. So the fact that we can only live in certain regions makes people live in a certain vicinity of each other where they can have community. And beyond that, it's just simply God showing off His creation. So there's many answers to that.
As a follow-up, in light of the perfect design of our universe, right? This universe is finely tuned for us to live, and very well, there might be different types of life adapted for different situations. How does the theory of climate change as a danger to our globe affect our knowledge of the intelligent design of the universe?
Oh. Talk a little bit.
What's really interesting about our climate is you see so many feedback loops. So, for instance, plate tectonics will recycle materials; it'll produce more carbon dioxide. Of course, that's on the period of millions of years, so we have to be conscious about that. But the other issue is, what about the way technology is damaging our environment? We'll go beyond climate change. I mean, let's talk about things like smog in Beijing or Los Angeles. Let's talk about polluting the ocean. Let's talk about plastics in the ocean, which are constricting animals. What happens is technology is a tool. It's a gift from our Creator. God said, go out and multiply, to understand the world, to advance culture and civilization. But again, because of the fall, humans now use technologies in ways that are self-destructive. So part of the fall, our broken relationship with God, is a broken relationship between us and others, but also it's a broken relationship between us and nature. So if we were in harmony with God, if we were listening to his voice, if we were acting wisely, we would have technology and patterns of nature that are in harmony instead of acting in such a way that's destroying nature. So that's simply an evidence of the fact that our broken relationship with God is spilling over in our broken relationship with nature in such a way that we act selfishly and foolishly to destroy it. So part of repentance is for people not just to restore their relationship with God and each other, but to restore our relationship with nature so we act in a way that promotes health, human flourishing, and a healthy ecology.
I think if there are engineers in the audience, they would also tell you there's no such thing as a perfect design. When you're engineering something, there are always trade-offs. And the more complicated you make something, the easier it is to break it in some ways. We can use instruments in a good way or a bad way. Technology in itself is neutral. We could be doing a lot more if we had the right goals with which to use our technology.
And as long as we're on that topic, let's see. I think one question that was beneath the question was, what about imperfect design in nature? Like a classic example is people would say that the eyes are wired backwards. So when light comes through the lens, the photoreceptors are actually backwards, and you first have your neurons and various tissues, and then the photoreceptors are actually facing away from the light. And people say, what a stupid design, who would do that? Well, as it turns out, that is the only way our eyes can be designed. Because unlike, let's say, a squid, human photoreceptors are very energetic. They require lots of nutrients. They burn out very quickly. So if our eyes were designed such that the photoreceptors faced forward, they wouldn't get the nutrients they need to work. They would shed cones and we'd go blind. So the backwards wiring of the eye is actually a beautiful design. In fact, there's these Mueller cells that act like fiber optic cables that will actually direct light of the right frequency to your photoreceptors. So this is a classic, what I call the imperfection of the gaps argument. When people look at the universe, they look at life, they think, that's not the way I would design it. And largely because the people saying that aren't engineers, what happens is when people actually look at it who are engineers, they think that's not bad design, that's amazing design. Another example would be the panda's thumb. That's not bad design, it's beautifully designed for eating bamboo, which is what pandas do. The same thing with junk DNA. People used to believe that about 98% of human DNA was junk. What happened is people that believed in design said, I bet you that's not junk. I bet you that's like an operating system of a computer. Guess what? With ENCODE, with the advancement of genetics, people are seeing that what they used to think was junk is part of an operating system. Things like retroviral DNA, things like pseudogenes, they keep finding uses for them. So what happens as science advances, what consistently happens is what people used to think is poor design is now seen as exceptional design.
Here's a fun one. What about aliens? How would your answers to life regarding fine-tuning change if we were to find life on another planet?
Not a bit. If we find life on other planets, I expect that it will show itself to have necessitated fine-tuning. And it's quite clear. There's a recent book out, I think published under the Discovery banner, called Unbelievable, where the author, Michael Keyes, talks about some myths. And one myth that he talks about is how we have always thought that it has to be only us. And actually, it really doesn't bother theologians at all, the idea of alien life. Some of you are C.S. Lewis fans, you'll know that he played with that idea. So if God is creator and theism is true, then if God created aliens, then God created aliens.
Dr. Larmer, what is the difference between divine intervention versus intelligent design? Is there a difference?
Can you repeat the question?
Is there a difference between divine intervention and intelligent design? Is there a difference, and what would it be?
I've just written a paper, not going to be talking about it today, but intelligent design and theistic evolutionists, in theory, they could agree on a lot of things. In practice, many proponents of intelligent design, Michael Behe being a notable exception, would tend to go the intervention route. Pretty well all theistic evolutionists in contemporary times talk about front-loading. That is to say that God sets it up so it will just unfold without any subsequent intervention.
Could you just quickly unpack for our audience, just generally, what's the schema in theistic evolution and how God intervenes for that to come about? What does this understanding look like?
Well, I'm cautious that last night we talked of we don't want to have intramural fights between Christians. I tend to think that theistic evolution, as it's commonly employed, tends to be deistic. One notable distinction between the intelligent design theorists, well, there are three notable distinctions. I think one is whether it's front-loaded or intervention. The other is whether design can be recognized or not. And what was the third? I had it a moment ago, but I'm a senior. You have divine intervention. Third is methodological naturalism. Theistic evolutionists, they may say there's design, but they will say that design has to be inferred by faith. So they will talk of a theology of nature, saying, if we first believe in God, then maybe in looking at biology we can see design. I would much prefer the bottom-up approach and say, look, we routinely recognize design, and from that we have good evidence of a designer. And so in other words, I see the origin development of life as a line of evidence leading us to God, rather than saying, well, we believe in God and we can interpret it this way.
One of the big distinctions is where is the design? Like people can talk about the fine-tuning of the laws of nature. Actually, I just did. And that's design, obviously. But the question is, did a creator set up the laws, set up the initial conditions, and then allow it to unfold so that the origin of life was just a natural product of those initial conditions and the natural laws of physics? And then later on, God ordained this process of evolution to produce more advanced life and ultimately humans. That, in principle, is reasonable. It's entirely reasonable to think God could have set everything up in such a way to produce life and evolution. He didn't. That entire framework is based on science, which is now known to be false. That's a big problem. Let's talk about the idea of front-loading. The idea of front-loading is that it's like a pool shark. If you imagine someone who's an incredible pool player, they hit the ball and they sink all the balls at once because of the incredible fine-tuning of the initial condition. But that can't be the case because of quantum mechanics. Because in quantum mechanics, you have something called quantum indeterminacy, where you have like probability waves moving with time. It would be kind of like if you're trying to shoot a pool shot in the middle of an earthquake. The constant jiggling and moving of the balls would prevent the pool shot from working. The initial information would be lost because of all this quantum fuzziness. So if you set up the initial conditions in the universe with absolute precision, the quantum indeterminacy, all the quantum fluctuations would destroy the information in a fraction of a second. That's not going to work. If you go for more like a Bohmian interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is deterministic, don't worry about what that means, except for you physicists over there, that wouldn't work either, because when you deal with quantum mechanics, everything becomes quantized, which means you can't set up initial conditions with absolute precision. So if you look at chaotic effects, what that means is that when the universe develops, if you change the initial conditions by the smallest amount, then the outcome changes exponentially. So what happens is in order to set up the initial universe to produce life, you have to have absolute precision, which is prevented by quantum mechanics. So the whole idea of front-loading will not work. It's fiction. And when you look at the origin of life, which you will when I speak again, life is an impossibility through natural processes. And I'll talk about that for a good 45 minutes.
Again, to be a simple philosopher, I think it's helpful to distinguish between necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition, you can't have the thing without that condition. So if you're going to make a ham sandwich, you've got to have some ham. But simply having ham is not going to get you the ham sandwich. Even for life to originate, to evolve, there has to be initial fine-tuning. The question is whether that initial fine-tuning is sufficient to get you what you want. And I think we agree that it's not enough. So I would see, showing my colors, divine intervention is also a necessary condition if you're going to get life.
Thank you very much. Let's take a moment to thank our panelists.